Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Again, this is Shankar Swaminathan speaking to you from New Jersey, United States. Yesterday, I came across a report about the Indian government issuing an advisory kind of thing. It's a kind of caution, essentially addressing people who are aspiring to go to Canada. It could be Canadian students or people who want to go there, migrate on job skills category as a permanent resident or on the work visa. So the caution, the kind of warning that is actually being issued by the Indian government is in general to everyone to be careful about what is happening in the Canadian conditions today. Essentially, the government, what they are talking about is a hate crime that is supposed to be, according to the Indian government, that is supposed to be taking place in Canada. And the Canadian conditions presently providing such opportunities or such a climate. The Canadian conditions providing a climate conducive for hate crimes to be taking place. And I don't really know what is the basis upon which the Indian government has thought it fit to come up with such an advisory today. I don't know what is the statistics that they have, but I am actually one who have lived in Canada for over 10 years, almost close to about 12-13 years I have been there, and for the past five years I have been in the United States. In fact, I am a Canadian passport holder. I was fairly well settled in Canada before I actually moved to the United States. So I think I am actually in a good position to basically talk about it in some detail and provide a kind of perspective about the accuracy of the judgment of the Indian government. Plainly, I think, frankly, I feel it's slightly over the top and it's slightly exaggerated. It doesn't really, conditions really in Canada really do not warrant such a cautionary advisory to be issued to people. Because today the conditions are such that a lot of people, a lot of students are actually going to Canada. It was not the case before, because in the US, students usually preferred to go to United States before, because after the completion of their studies, they would be given an extended visa for about a year to find a job and settle down with a green card or whatever. So that was not the case before in Canada, but today they have actually, in the recent years, they have actually, in Canada too, they have actually started doing. I mean, they have relaxed things a little bit, and students who aspire to move to Canada for higher education, after the completion of their studies, they are being given offered visa for 1 or 2 years, depending upon the level of study that they actually come to. So that they could find a job and settle down in Canada, which is a win-win situation. It is actually good for both the aspiring student and the Canadian conditions, Canadian society. So that's how it is. And similarly, there are a lot of people who actually aspire to move to Canada, migrate to Canada on permanent resident basis, because the Canadian conditions are really very good, very smooth, a very peaceful climate, and relatively crime-free. So it's fairly quite secure. So people really like to move to Canada, though the opportunities are a little less than what it is in US. But people do prefer to go to Canada because the conditions are really more peaceful, and there are a lot of the Indian diaspora there and a lot of expatriates. So one would not really feel very much out of place when they move from one country to the other, which is reason why there are over 200 nationalities, people from different countries all over the world who have settled down in Toronto itself. Toronto is the bustling commercial capital of Canada, and there are over people from 200 nationalities who have settled down in Toronto. So there are, when I say 200 nationalities who have settled down in Toronto, there are certain groups who are which are really a little more assertive, little more vocal. They could be even termed to be quite aggressive in making their pronouncements. And one such group, I would say, is the group of Punjabi Sikhs, because these are people, most of them have moved in the 80s during the Khalistan movement time, in those period actually, when a lot of people actually moved to Canada as refugees, and refugees, Canada being a signatory to the United Nations Covenant on Refugees, so Canada has its own actually parameters by which they could actually accept refugees from different countries. So from time to time, the parameters, the yardstick differs in determining who would qualify to be admitted as a refugee. In any case, in the 80s, arguably, Canada chose to provide refugee status to a lot of people from Punjab during the time of the Khalistan movement. Okay, now those people who actually came down to Canada, moved to Canada in the 80s, subsequently they brought the whole family together, and in fact it is actually said many villages actually chose to move from Punjab to Canada in those times. So that's the extent of it. But still, with all that, let me tell you, if somebody were to assume that the whole of Canada is full of Punjabis, no, it's not so. Actually, see, the Punjabi Sikhs and Punjabis, Sikhs in particular, they would actually comprise about 1.4% of the Canadian population. So the Canadian population can be assumed to be somewhere around 36 million. Okay, about 35 to 40 million today. So in that, about 1.4%, you can actually, it's anybody's. It's an easy calculation to make. So it should be around 450,000 to 500,000 would be the number of Sikhs who would be in Canada. But they actually stand as one group. It's one of the very well knit groups, very close knit groups. They really hold on to each other, they cling to each other. They actually do, in any position that they take, particularly the political positions that they take, they essentially cling together as one group. Now, because of the conditions and the times in which those people actually moved to Canada, it's a fact, it's a bitter truth, most of them actually harbor anti-Indian sentiments even today. I have had the opportunity to be providing counseling service, because I was basically a counselor to a lot of Sikhs. I had many Sikh clients. I have interacted with them very extensively, and I have not discussed so much as politics, but I have discussed enough to know their minds. It's basically, essentially, they have strong anti-Indian sentiments. It's there. Now, we have to understand, so such sentiments, they also give expression to that in various forms. I also had the opportunity to go into some gurudwaras and all that, where Sant Bhindranwale is glorified, and they actually keep talking about Khalistan movement, and their ultimate objective being to attain freedom from India and all that. That would actually remain as just a wishful thinking. Anyone who can be quite a little realistic about what is going on and about the state of affairs, the international political scenario, etc., would know that majority of the Sikhs are in Punjab, India. They do not actually prefer Khalistan. They do not really want to go away from India, and that's a fact. In fact, to the extent that even a party for Sikhs, Akali Dal, has been completely marginalized within Punjab itself. So, but this still, the vocal section of people in Canada, they actually keep talking about it. But not that it's going to be effective, and it doesn't really have to be taken cognizance of. But the point is, like in any democratic setup, here too, there are two major parties, the Liberals and the Tories. They would actually vie with each other to get the support of the Sikhs, because the Sikhs are concentrated in a few Punjabi Sikhs, Punjabi population. They are concentrated in few neighborhoods, cities, if you may call it, small cities actually. One is there's a place called Brampton, which is a suburb of Toronto, and in Vancouver, in British Columbia, there are sizable number of Sikhs. So they actually, these parties try to placate them, try to keep them in good humor, so that they can actually get a chunk of Sikh votes to them, because this community actually votes as a bloc. At least that's a belief. The majority of the Sikhs, they actually vote as a bloc. So in fact, one of the recent elections, Stephen Harper, who was the Prime Minister then, he took as many as some 7 or 8 visits to this Brampton alone, the neighborhood of Toronto, where there are more than 60% of the Sikhs. The population comprises of about 60% of the Sikhs there. I have worked in those places, so I know these places fairly well. Now, they vote as a bloc. Now, the total number of MPs in the House of Commons in Canada is about 338, I think, if I'm not mistaken, and out of which there are about 18 Sikh MPs right now. 18 out of 338, and because they actually take a position as a bloc, they also happen to be a little more influential than the other groups, which may not really see the necessity to vote. To gang up and cling together on even on taking a political positions and all that. People may have different independent views, and different MPs, even though they belong to have the same. They belong to the same. Originally, they are from the same country and all that. They may have different views. It's not the case with Sikhs, Punjabi Sikhs. At least that's a belief. So with that in mind, these two parties who try to woo the Sikhs. That's what they do. So that's possibly one reason that all of these pronouncements about Khalistan in some distant future date or a hypothetical situation or whatever, in that figment of imagination, are basically they don't really take cognizance of it. It's not basically all that serious thing. Now, the Indian government has been really a little touchy and sensitive to the fact that there is a group of Sikhs here in Canada. They have actually held a referendum to find out how many of them would, how many of the Punjabis, how many of the Indian expatriates, mainly Punjabis, they are holding a referendum to know how many of them want separate Punjab, Khalistan from India. And naturally, most of these people who have settled down here, they would actually vote to say that, yeah, we would like to have a separate state for ourselves within India, away from India. Now they can actually keep talking anything, and this is all basically nonsense, and that's a fact. And everyone knows it's a nonsense, and they don't really count for anything when you actually take the whole Indian geopolitics into account. The Sikhs in Canada do not count for anything. They may have their own wish. They may actually like to do something, but nobody in India, none of the Sikhs, none of their brothers in India within Punjab agree with them. In fact, to the extent, as I said before, now Aam Aadmi Party has gained majority within Punjab. So it's not likely to happen. But when the Indian government takes it so seriously that it feels like issuing an advisory like that, in Canada there's a lot of hate crime. No, there is no hate crime at all. We'll come to that a little later. Now they are trying to give credence to whatever this small community within Canada is doing. Again, it's not just because this group actually cling together, stand firm as one on any given issue, political issue particularly. They are really influential. It's not just that. Most of them are really very successful, and there is a system here, the Canadian system. See, if someone actually wants to claim nomination for his party for a particular constituency, then he has to actually give so many signatures from many of the his supporters and actual voters. So based on that, he actually gets a nomination. So when the Sikh community, when somebody is going to actually contest on their behalf, not necessarily on their behalf, no, not exactly, sorry, not exactly on their behalf, they are going to contest for one of the seats in parliament, they can actually bring a lot of signatories. So by that approach, they make sure that they do get a lot of nominations from the community. Okay, so that's what they do. So due to some of these different variables, the Sikh community happens to be a little influential, and particularly because they are very vocal and very assertive, unlike many other communities from different parts of the world. For example, take for example Ukrainians. There are about 1 million Ukrainians in 1.3 million Ukrainians in the whole of Canada. Now, even when there is a invasion against Ukraine by Russia, those people are not really so vocal. They are not doing any demonstration, nothing outwardly they are doing. They just talk to them. So that's the kind of approach. Because once they actually they move to Canada, they just look at whatever is happening from their country. Of course, they are really disturbed, but they know that they cannot really do much. So they are not politically, I would say, possibly they are also not politically that conscious. Okay, maybe that's maybe one of the reasons. So not many communities are as assertive as the Punjabi Sikh community. So that's what it is. That's the reason why they keep creating some kind of ruckus from time to time. They keep talking about Khalistan or whatever, some noise they are creating. So the best thing for Indian government to do is completely ignore, like the Canadian government itself is doing. In any case, democracy in these countries, both Canada, America, UK or whatever, in these countries it is definitely possible for minorities, any section of people, to voice any of their opinion, any of their views. They can actually give expression to any of their views outwardly, and they can advocate for any cause. Unless it becomes so drastic, so it's going to be so grievously harmful to the country's interest or something, nobody really takes any of these things seriously. Everything goes by the spirit of democracy. So people have the right to talk, people have the mind to talk. So that's exactly what it is. So finally, what I feel, okay, when you talk about hate crime, between Canada and United States, if you are going to talk about hate crime, relatively, it's nothing. Even between Canada and UK, between Canada and India, you compare Canada with any other country, for example, except all of those Scandinavian countries or countries like Sweden, Denmark, Norway, all of these countries. I mean, they are definitely more peaceful possibly than Canada, but Canada is a very, very peaceful country. And once in a while, possibly once in a year or once in 2 years or something, you come to hear about some kind of hate crime somewhere. So let's not actually blow it up beyond we have beyond proportion, and because that's actually going to do a positive, definitely a disservice to all those people who are aspiring to go to Canada. One of the things we have to know is, when people choose to migrate to other countries, it's actually a strength for India. It's actually a strength for India because you've got so many people actually who are going to act as ambassadors for your country. So with the result that, for example, you can actually see there's a lot of celebrations here going on for Diwali, everything, Indian Independence Day. So people take a lot of pride in their heritage. People take a lot of pride in the country where they have actually come from. And so that really acts to the advantage of the country of origin, basically. So it's not actually, it's very short-sighted, and it's not in India's we are talking about India. So it's not in India's interest itself to say or do anything that's going to discourage people from moving abroad. Besides the foreign exchange that they are actually plowing back into the economy, Indian economy, there are so many other ways by which the expatriates prove to be a great strength to India itself. I have had clients from Guyana, West Indies. Guyana is the place where many of the Indians have actually migrated in the early 20th century, 1900s and all that. Those people still take a lot of pride in their origin, because their grandfathers, their ancestors moved from India, UP, Bihar, and because a lot of people actually went there as plantation laborers in those days. So the descendants, they still take their pride in their Indian heritage. So that's the kind of feeling that they have, and that's only to the advantage of India, because you really create a lot of goodwill. Um, so when a tiny section of minority harbor anti-Indian sentiments, they are just being vocal, so they are heard better. But the vast majority of Indian population, Indian expatriates here, they got a lot of good sentiments for India, and all the time they think about India with, as much as myself, with a lot of fondness. Okay, so that's what it is. So it's not. So the Indian country, Indian government. I know Indian government has not had a very good relationship equations with the government of Pierre Trudeau, the present Prime Minister, who has been a little immature when dealing with um, dealing with affairs that could be a little sensitive to India. Um, but it's just about that, nothing more. So that doesn't really have to be given more importance than it deserves. Okay, so the Indian government, I think has been a little too hasty when it says talks about hate crime within Canada. If they have actually talked about hate crime within a particular state in the United States, I could well understand, because there are states where there could be a lot of hate crimes against Indians. It has happened quite a bit. But that's definitely not the case in India, because Canadian society is one where violence is completely abhorred actually. Okay, if there is a community that's basically prone to a little bit of violence, then that's not going to be accepted by the whole Canadian society. That community is going to be marginalized. There were Sri Lankan Tamils in Canada. I can give you a lot of examples for this. There were Tamils in Canada, some of them from Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, LTTE, long back. And I mean different groups, different militant groups in Canada, Sri Lanka, they were trying to actually operate in Toronto, but they were all actually expelled. They were all deported. I mean, so if there is violence, if there is no way that the Canadian system, the Canadian government is going to actually put up with it, and they will definitely curb it in the, nip it in the curb. So the Indian government's hate crime warning, perhaps at least right now, it's just not warranted, and it's not necessarily. It's possibly a disservice to the aspirants want to move to Canada on different basis. I mean, on different visa categories, student visa, permanent resident, or work visa, or something. Because there's a lot of opportunity in Canada, and Indians in particular have a lot of potential to move to Canada. When we actually, because in terms of the qualifications, in terms of the expertise, in terms of the technical potentials that we have, and the technically qualified people that I'm talking about. See, all those things are very much needed in Canada, and there is no country in the world except possibly China which can provide such technical manpower to Canada in sizable number. So Indian government should not say or do or act in any way that would actually stop people or discourage people from moving to Canada. And at least at the moment, this I very strongly feel this kind of caution, though perhaps well-meaning, it's actually quite misplaced, and it is just not warranted. Okay, thank you.